And welcome to this, the 44th episode of American Spirits, wherein we study the harmony, the tranquility, and the brotherly feeling that was exampled by the politics of the Texas Republic. Joining us again is Mr. George Bagby. How are you doing, George?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to be with you. Thank you.
Wonderful. And also with us is our resident expert on the American Southwest, Mr. Thomas Wayne Riley. How are you, sir?
Very good. Thank y'all for having me.
Thank you for coming. All right, gentlemen, what is on tap for the evening?
We aim to talk about the politics of the Republic of Texas, which lasted for 10 years, had three presidential administrations, and was a very interesting operation. It was kind of a quest for survival in a tenuous existence.
Mm.
They were struggling to make it on their own and eventually got admitted into the Union. So we'll talk about the strategies they tried to employ to survive in this period of independence.
Yeah, I believe we talked a little bit last time about the initial feelers that were put out to statehood. What was the general feeling on that topic amongst the Texas population?
They were strongly in favor of it. They really wanted to be admitted to the Union. The vast majority of them had come over from the Southeast into Texas, so they were all born Americans for the most part, and they had quite an affinity for the United States. And the Union would have offered them protection from Mexico, which they certainly needed, and it would have also meant the relieving of their substantial debts and financial problems, which was coincidentally the deal that cinched the original American Union under the Philadelphia Constitution, where the Washington administration absorbed all the wartime debts of the American states. So that was on the table anyway. It needed to be negotiated. But the Union under Jackson's administration was in no condition to admit the gigantic territory of Texas. And Andrew Jackson and his diplomats who were interacting with Texas, they shot that down immediately. They said, we are in no position to advance this in Congress. This is not on the table. You can't count on us to admit you into the Union. You have to fend for yourselves for the time being. Now, Jackson was the most advantageous person that Sam Houston could have possibly had in the White House to advance Texas statehood. They were personal friends, they were confidants, and they were natural political allies. But Jackson knew that he did not have the support he needed in Congress. It was going to be a divisive fight with sectional interests involved. And Jackson had already picked some very divisive issues to confront in his administration. So he was using all of his resources for domestic policy. He was in no position to annex Texas.
Jackson chose to hoard his political capital for important domestic issues rather than squandering them on some foreign adventure.
Yes, indeed. And it was well known that war with Mexico was in the offing if Texas was admitted to the Union. Yeah, go ahead, Riley.
Not to skip ahead too much, but in 10 years, I named one of my episodes this Jackson in relation to Texas being annexed. We'll say war is a blessing. But yeah, he couldn't do it at that time. And one thing, real quick, that first presidential election, it was Sam Houston, Henry Smith, who was governor during the Revolution, and Stephen F. Austin. Houston got 5,119 votes. Smith, who was responsible for a lot of miscalculations, got 743, and poor Stephen F. Austin got 587.
The mob is ever fickle. We talked last time about the Texas Declaration of Independence, but now that they are informed that they have to stand on their own 2 feet, what constitutional arrangement did they come to, and how did that transpire?
It's rather comparable to the Articles of Confederation, as far as laissez-faire. So they did not want a tax burden. This was a major factor in the revolt against Mexico. They wanted lots of local control, local prerogative, and they elected a Congress that was not at all interested in erecting any tax burden to relieve the treasury pressures. So they had big war debts coming out of the Texas War of Independence. And Sam Houston's policy was to try to reduce that burden, being that he couldn't get any more revenue out of Congress. He does impose some direct taxes. He does impose some revenue tariffs on imports into Texas, but
Was there
these are
any
only shoring up things.
was there any discussion of selling land? That's how the U.S. federal government funded its operations in large part during the 19th century. Did they parcel off pieces of land and sell them to clear the debts?
In Houston's second term, he advocates that, and he gets that through Congress in his second term, but not in his first term. So what makes Houston really outstanding is his very pragmatic approach to Texan affairs. Houston dramatically cuts the size of the Texas infantry, so he reduces it from thousands to hundreds. This is a bold move in the wake of San Jacinto because a state of war still exists with Mexico. The Mexican government has disavowed the treaties of Velasco. They do not recognize the independence of Texas. They do not recognize the boundaries, and they vow that they will retake Texas. So a de facto state of war still exists. They consider Texas a rebellious province. And Sam Houston's position is we cannot afford a large standing army. We must cut this. So he's cutting expenditures all over the place, and he's seeking solutions through diplomacy. So Houston has 3 big diplomatic priorities. Domestically, he's just trying to cut expenditure and get the budget under control so that they don't have runaway inflation. On foreign policy, he is emphasizing diplomacy. He sends envoys to the United States. He wants to advance annexation at the earliest possible opportunity. He's very discouraged when Jackson responds in the negative that this is not in the cards in the near future at all. So Jackson's very forthright with him. You need to prepare to fend for yourselves for the time being. He sends envoys to Mexico. He's trying to arrange some kind of peace agreement and some kind of modus vivendi with Mexico. This is also not forthcoming. The Mexicans do not respond. He also advances negotiations with the Indian nations in the territory of Texas. Sam Houston always has a conciliatory policy towards the nations. He wants to live peaceably with them. Also, Indian warfare in Texas is a major burden on the government. It is extremely expensive, and Houston wants a peaceable coexistence with the nations. Lines of demarcation where the Indians have certain territories where they're more or less in control. He wants ceasefires with ongoing wars with the nations, and he's contending in the legislature that this should be the priority for the simple practical reason they can't afford to prosecute war with the nations. The Texas legislature has a much more belligerent sort of opinion towards the nations than Houston does. And that's also popular. When Anglo-Texans are thinking about their relations with the nations, they are usually thinking about the Kiowa, the Comanche, and the Apache. They're thinking about raids on civilians. They're thinking about hostage situations. They're thinking about kidnapping, pillage, torture, and murder. They're thinking of the worst examples of Indian wars on the Western frontier. And that was also the common experience in Texas. Yes, go ahead, Riley.
So last weekend I went to or 2 weekends ago, I went to a reenactment here in New Mexico at Fort Stanton, and I met what I thought was called a Lipan Apache. No, it's a Lipan Apache from West Texas. And it was really cool to talk to him. They did a whole bunch of hooting and hollering dance for like an hour and a half. It got a little old. It was cool for 5 minutes, but I wanted to just keep shooting cannons and muskets. But I kind of talked to him for a little bit about Texas history, and he was like, "Yeah, we didn't have much interaction. We would just go raid the Central Texas, although the Central Texans would have called themselves West Texans at the time. We just went over there and raided a couple times, and then they kind of put us down eventually. I mean, they were a big problem. The Lipan, maybe I'll still call them Lipan, but the Apaches there in Texas were famous for hiding out in the Big Bend area, going down to Mexico, stealing a bunch of stuff, selling it to the Anglos, and then go taking it from the Anglos and selling it to the Mexicans.
There's a lot of land piracy. That's the incentive for a lot of that. You know, just going and pillaging and making money off of it and such. So there are reasonable, there's rationale for the popular Texas position that the Indians need to be put down and put under control, because this was a really serious problem, especially in the western areas of Texas, exposed to the expanse of the frontier. And so Houston really struggled to get his diplomatic incentives or innovations off the ground with the Native Americans. What's going on down in Mexico immediately afterwards is important. So Santa Anna, he does go up to Washington the year after San Jacinto. He's released by President Burnett, and he does some diplomacy, claims that he's going to advocate for Texas independence and borders and such. He goes back down to Mexico, and he's been overthrown by Bustamante. So he retires for a period at Veracruz and kind of writes a defense of his regime, which is a fairly important historical document. It has been translated. Santa Anna's account of the war in Texas and his defeat at the hands of the Texas Republicans and all. So this is, it's his position. It's self-serving, as Santa Anna typically is, kind of two-faced about things. Santa Anna is known to switch sides to go with whatever seems to have the most hope of success. It's kind of a pragmatic sort of character. He reemerges in 1838 with the so-called Pastry War in Mexico. So what had happened was, during Santa Anna's nationalist government, where he's centralizing things and saying, basically, Mexico for the Mexicans, let's put down the regional forces. We don't like federalism. We don't like regional identities. And we don't like foreigners. There are a bunch of impromptu riots in Mexico. They are demonstrating against foreign-owned businesses. And among other things, they despoil a bunch of foreign businessmen. Many of them are French, or at any rate, the French take exception to this, and they contend with Bustamante's government, just in the wake of their loss of Texas, that they deserve reparations for their citizens who had been kicked out of Mexico and had their properties seized by these rioters. So the reason it's called the Pastry War, which is a funny name for this conflict, there was Monsieur Ramontel of Mexico City, a French national who ran a bakery, and his business was despoiled by the rioters very rudely, and he was kicked out of Mexico. So he took his case to the French government, and he said, this was wrong. I deserve restitution for this. And the French took this up with the Mexicans, and they demand 60,000 pesos for Monsieur Ramontel, the pastry chef, and ultimately 600,000 pesos for a number of other French nationals who had lost their property in these riots. So the Mexicans, they refused to pay. They say, no, that was the evil dictator that did that to you, and we have no responsibility for that. That regime is gone. The men responsible for that have no connection to us. We don't inherit their responsibilities and so on. The Mexicans also happened to owe an awful lot of money to French bankers at the time, and they are not paying. The French have financed Mexican independence to some degree. It was mostly the British that did that. The British actually owned most of the Mexican debt, which is an important feature we'll get back to by and by. So on December 5th, 1838, the French have dispatched a fleet to bombard Veracruz. They eventually take a fort on the Mexican coast, and this is a punitive expedition. They really just want the restitution they say their citizens are due. Well, Santa Anna reemerges. So winter of 1838, Santa Anna volunteers for service with Bustamante's government, and he's leading troops on the beaches of Mexico against the French incursion. And he's hit with grape shot on horseback, rallying his men at Veracruz, and it obliterates his horse beneath him, and it destroys his leg. I think it's his left leg. So this results in an amputation, but it's done under such extraordinary circumstances, the Mexicans are quite inspired by it. So Santa Anna comes back to political prominence at this point. He's got a renewal of honors in Mexico. So in 1839, he's acting president of Mexico in between governments. He becomes president of Mexico again in 1841. And this is very applicable to the story of Texas, because Santa Anna really wants to go back into Texas. He wants to retake Texas. So, yes, go ahead, Riley.
Riley, I fear you're muted.
1838, the same year. Thank you. France was willing to recognize Texas, be one of the first countries to do so, and they were going to give them $5 million, which would have greatly alleviated their war debt. But there was something called the Pig War at about the same time as the Pastry War, and it basically amounted to a hotel owner had a pig. His name was Richard Bullock, and his pigs knocked over the French ambassador's fence in Austin, ate his vegetables, went into his house, and ate his bed linens. And a fight broke out in the street between the French ambassador and this Richard Bullock. France withdrew its loan in recognition of Texas.
That is a wonderful particular Texan problem.
For want of a bed sheet, a treaty was lost.
That's very interesting, because there's another pig war that took place in the Puget Sound in Washington State. Do you know about this?
I think I do, actually, but it has been like 5 years since I read about it.
Well, I found myself in need to be able to talk about it recently. It had to do with border disputes between the Dominion of Canada and the authorities, the American authorities in Washington State. And so there was this tense standoff between British soldiers and American soldiers on the San Juan Islands in the 1850s. And it ultimately resulted in a new treaty because there was a misinterpretation or a vagueness about the boundary in the Puget Sound between the Dominion of Canada and the United States.
Which
That's
Polk
also called the
had
Pig
written up,
War.
I think.
And
Yeah,
where did
there
the
was
pig figure?
well, it was an American settler in the San Juan Islands who killed a hog that was rooting around in his vegetable garden that belonged to the Hudson's Bay Company.
Ah,
And so the Hudson's Bay Company contended, well, the Americans have no right to be here anyway, and they're killing our hogs. And the Americans say, well, of course we have a right to be here. We got this treaty that says Puget Sound boundary is such and such. And this resulted in an occupation of the San Juan Islands, which are minor islands in the Puget Sound, to this day have very little population. Just a curiosity, another pig war. But so the Santa Ana has a renewed rise to prominence. So uh, we've talked about Sam Houston's first administration in Texas. He's very thrifty. He does shore up the finances of the republic. And then in 1838, we see the counterpart in the story of the Texas Republic, and that's the administration of Mirabeau Lamar. Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar,
ah,
who is the great Texas nationalist. Really delightful character on a level. I love his braggadocio. I love his belligerent stance, his emphatic insistence on Texas maximum. He just wants to make Texas everything Texas could possibly be, and he wants to do it with bold action.
He's the
And
original everything in Texas is big. Everything is bigger in
yes,
Texas. That's it. He fought valiantly in the Revolution, and he will fight valiantly in the Mexican War as well, actually.
so he wants to make Texas its own thing. He's not particularly interested in the annexation. He's not pursuing that as a solution to Texas problems. He wants Texas to find its independence, establish itself on the world stage on its own glory, to do this by laurels in battle, to do this with bold action on the field. And that's how he ought to be remembered. Now, the fact that he failed in doing this well illustrates the downsides of putting all your eggs in the military basket, as he did. So, in Lamar's administration, we see a incredible influx of immigration into Mexico. So he wants, or into Texas, I should say. Forgive me. A tremendous amount of immigration into Texas. He wants Texas to grow as quickly as possible and acquire all the resources needed by this rapid boom of growth, which is something we should relate to Texas today. You know, any kind of business activity, Texas wants to be on the forefront of that. Any sort of high tech investment, Texas wants to be on the forefront of that. They want to grow their cities to be as dense as Peking or something, and maybe even as ugly as Peking. And they think that there are going to be benefits to that offset the ugly characteristics. Wealth will grow with growth, with economic activity, and we see something of that with Lamar. This is an enduring feature of the character of Texas, and Lamar has one administration 1838 to 1841, we see the growth of Texas from about 40,000 people in 1836. There are only about 40,000 people there. By 1845, it's over 100,000. So it doubles in size in only a few years.
And a big part of that is the 1837 economic panic in the United States.
Absolutely. Yes, that's a major incentive. There's a big panic that affects the lower Mississippi Valley. A lot of people go bankrupt and are chagrined to find that their homes are taken as collateral when their loans fail. And so they migrate to Texas. And one of the things Lamar does while he's president is the Homestead Act of Texas. Not only does he revive land grants, so this is comparable to the Mexican territorial stage where they're giving land grants to the immigrants. Whoever comes in can get a league of land, about a square mile of land. They revive that. They even revive the impresario system. So they have land agents that go and recruit settlers to come into Texas. Among them is one Henri Castro, who is a French millionaire, and he brings a lot of continental Europeans to the area up by Dallas, Texas. And this is a successful colony, though poor Mr. Henri Castro goes bankrupt in the process building his colony. But it is a successful colony, and he brings in thousands of people up there. Another one is a German colony in the hill country of Texas. And they bring in a substantial number of German Protestants into central Texas, which is still a major feature in modern day Texas. The hill country is renowned for its German flavor in its towns, and also its beer, which these Germans had brought into Texas. So the Homestead Act I mentioned, passed by the Texas Congress, it meant that the primary dwelling of a landowner was not dispensable in bankruptcy. So this was very attractive to a lot of Americans fleeing the 37 panic. They thought this was more advantageous. And obviously, Texas offered an awful lot of opportunity for anyone that wanted to risk the wrath of Mexico in this rather exposed new country. They had virtually no tax burden. It was a very laissez-faire kind of economy, and they had practical free trade. The Texas legislature was trying to enforce some revenue tariffs, but the Texas coastline is very broad, and the Texas mindset was, well, if you can get it in and avoid the customs duties, you might as well do that. Who's going to stop you? Who's going to enforce the law? So there's widespread smuggling going on, skirting of the revenue tariffs, and the Texas government is struggling to collect revenues and administrate itself and enforce the law, especially after Sam Houston's cost-cutting tactics, reducing the administrative expense. So the population is growing very quickly. When Lamar, he makes some of his blunders. So Lamar is very belligerent towards the Native Americans. In this, his position is very popular. This is the way most of the Texans feel about the native tribes. When they think about Native Americans, they're grouping them all together. This is a commonplace. This is the way that the vast majority of Americans thinks about Native America. They don't distinguish between one tribe and another. When you get onto the ground level with them, we're talking about nations that are, in some sense, more diverse in culture and language than the entire world today.
Hmm.
They have 40 language family groups, not counting outlier languages. When you think of language groups today, you can kind of organize them continentally. You're not talking about dozens of language families. Like the Indo-European language family encompasses everything from Russian to Greek to Latin to French to English. That's just one language family. But there are dozens of language families among the Native Americans, even though they have very small populations in comparison. These are very diverse groups of people, but their numbers are so small and their lifestyle and culture is so similar, especially down in Texas. They aren't living very differently. They look very similar to each other, and no one can understand what they're saying anyway.
Mhm.
People do not distinguish between one Indian and another Indian. And so when they think of Indians, they think of the aggressive ones. They think of the Comanches. They think of the Apaches. And they have major beefs with them because they've been fighting very brutal wars on the Texas frontier for generations with these people. They do not trust them. And Lamar's policy of land grants, of seizing and dominating the territory of Texas, of dispensing that to as many immigrants as possible, preferably white Protestant immigrants, which is the Texas culture. They want to despoil these Indians. They do not trust them in the area. They want to force them out. They certainly want to bring them under control. And so they spend large sums on wars on the frontier against the Kiowa, the Apache, the Comanche, very large sums. We're talking about millions a year when they can't collect revenue. So they're borrowing a tremendous amount. They're inflating their way out of this. They're printing currency for this. There is an important event in 1840, right at the end of Lamar's tenure, where they convince the Comanche to come to Austin. Among other things, Lamar does remove the capital of Texas to San Felipe de Austin, which it becomes Austin, Texas. He takes his Secretary of War, who happens to be Confederate hero, future Confederate hero, Albert Sidney Johnston,
Hmm.
who falls at Shiloh. He's the Texas Secretary of War. He convenes a negotiation with Comanche leaders in Austin. They meet at the Council House, which is the state house in Austin. The Comanche bring a couple dozen chiefs, and they're supposed to bring hostages that they had captured in war on the Texas frontier. So there are lots of women and children that the Comanches had kidnapped and carried away for years. And this was the understanding of this meeting, that the Comanche were supposed to bring all these hostages to the negotiation, and they talk about peace and some more durable agreement with the Comanches. Well, the Comanche only bring one girl with them and a few adults. The Texans are expecting dozens of children that had been kidnapped off of frontier raids, like isolated homesteads. It's like the Searchers. Okay. The story of the Searchers is something that happened a great many times in West Texas, where isolated homestead gets raided, the women and children carried away and are never seen again. They get killed, they get made into concubines by the Apache or tortured to death. All of those things happen out there. Well, the Texans are incensed that the Comanche have not brought the hostages. There are a lot of people there that are expecting to be reunited with their families and all that. And Albert Sidney Johnston confronts the Comanche. Where are the hostages? Why didn't you bring the hostages? And they said, oh, well, we're waiting to see what your terms are for the negotiation. We'll bring the hostages after we've settled something with you here. Well, the Texans jumped for their guns at that point. They said, well, this is a betrayal. We're going to get our hostages back. And they attack the Comanche chieftains. The result is, it's called the Council House Fight. It's called the Council House Massacre. This takes place in March of 1840. 30 Comanche are killed. Another 7 Texans are killed. Dozens wounded on both sides. And the Comanche retreat and renew warfare. So we see something of the belligerent policy of Lamar, but we can also understand where he's coming from. And we can understand why his stance is popular given the circumstances. There are hundreds of citizens in Texas who demand action to be reunited with their kidnapped relatives, with their own children who had been carried away by the Comanches. And this is an intolerable situation. We would look askance at any modern American that would tolerate foreigners carrying American citizens away into slavery and captivity in modern circumstances. We wouldn't tolerate that at all. We would send in the Marines and we'd kill every last one of them. So this is not an unreasonable stance at all. But it did mean renewed war with the Cherokee, or with the Comanches, that the Texans could scarcely afford. So at the end of this, Lamar launches his most famous disastrous campaign, the 1841 Santa Fe expedition. So this is a curious affair. Lamar sends like 300 soldiers and merchants overland to Santa Fe, New Mexico. The idea is that they're going to establish trade in this area that Texas has claimed in the Treaty of Valesco. Texas claims the boundary of the Rio Grande all the way up through New Mexico and into Colorado.
They don't know where the headwaters are. They claim all the way up to Wyoming.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this funny panhandle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's this weird panhandle in the territorial claims of Texas at the time that extends all the way up into southern Wyoming. It's like the front range of the Rockies going all the way up to Laramie. So the Texans don't know that land. None of them have been up there. They don't know where the headwaters of the Rio Grande are. But they know that Santa Fe is in that area, and Santa Fe is a substantial and important town. So they send out this very quixotic excursion. Like this isn't really an invasion force. I mean, they have armed men and soldiers in this expedition, but they also have lots of merchants. They have pack animals, wagons, goods for trade in Santa Fe. But they also do not know the way to Santa Fe, and they don't understand the treacherous geography between West Texas and Santa Fe. And if you've ever been on that route, like this is a great American experience. Every American needs to drive from Oklahoma City to Albuquerque. And about the time you get to Amarillo, you want to stop and buy a crate of Aquafina and put it in your back seat, because you look out there and it's thirsty, thirsty country, and it gets a lot worse. By the time you get to Tucumcari, if you haven't bought some water to stick in your back seat for your own conscience sake, you'll do it by the time you get to Tucumcari.
You're muted, Riley.
That area, thank you. That area is called the Llano Estacado. And it's staked plains in Spanish, but nobody knows why it's called that. But it is, you go up if you're coming east or west, either way. It is a raised, one of the flattest places on the planet. And it is flat through its entirety, the Llano Estacado. People lose their minds up there because there's no water, there are no trees. Now, if you drive across it, there are things that want to make me become a domestic terrorist. They're called windmills. But anyways, it is a beautiful but forbidding, awful, grassy place with no trees and barely any water at all. And the Texans had no idea the Llano Estacado was there. They'd heard stories of it. They had no idea. And many of these guys lost their mind, got really tired, got real thirsty. And so when they came off the Llano Estacado near Tucumcari, well, the Mexican now officials were waiting for them. And this governor, Armijo, who sent that army out, will be important in the conquest of New Mexico. But New Mexico at that time, the Texans have been hearing rumors about how just absolutely the politics in New Mexico were terrible. They had asked to be independent from Mexico City. They were done with all their corrupt governors. And so Lamar kind of felt like right now is the time. Let's go get them. Now, he greatly underestimated the pride of New Mexicans, but yeah.
Now, you say Tucumcari. Is that how you say it?
I say everything wrong here. I live in the Sandia. Apparently, it's called Manzano, but I say Manzano. So I don't know. It's Sandia Manzano Mountains. I don't know. I guess I say everything wrong.
Oh, well, I've got a respect for the honest gringo pronunciation of things. I lived in Albuquerque for a few years. We always called it Tucumcari, but I don't know if I'm doing it wrong. I remember Manzano Mountains though. I do
Yep.
remember that.
I have no idea how to say anything here. Sometimes I get something perfectly right, and sometimes I sound like a Coloradan or a gringo, a Texan, just saying the absolute wrong pronunciation. And only New Mexicans know that I'm saying it wrong.
The history of New Mexico is the history of Anglos passing through and mispronouncing everything there. So this is a tradition of the place. There's a certain standing for it. Well, anyway, the Santa Fe expedition, so that these 300 odd soldiers and merchants, they go out across the desert towards Santa Fe, and by the time they get there, they are so desperate for succor, they're all starving to death and dying of thirst. Their animals are dying, crossing the great hard pan of the desert there. They surrender to Governor Armijo in Santa Fe. Governor Armijo initially wants to hang them all as insurrectionaries, rebels, traitors, but forbears. He calls a council in Santa Fe, and they say, "Well, let's ship them south to Mexico City as prisoners." And so these men, these adventurers, on their way to Santa Fe, they'd gone 1,300 miles to get to Santa Fe. They'd almost died, and then they march another 2,000 miles to Mexico City. And this is one of the many examples of the very arduous marches that take place in this area over the course of the story of the Republic of Texas and also the Mexican War. They eventually get ransomed out of captivity by the intercessions of the American and British authorities who intercede for their sakes down in Mexico City. So this is the last major action of the Lamar administration. He tries to advance Texas interests by military means, by belligerent policy, by trying to assert Texas control in the New Mexico region, and these things ultimately fail. He spends a tremendous amount of money. He's very amenable to the sentiment in Congress against tax collection. he wants to establish a national bank of Texas to centrally manage these financial affairs and issue bonds and such to undergird the Texas currency. But he is far in arrears in the Treasury. He only brings in $1 million of revenue in his tenure. He leaves with $7 million in debt. So inflation goes very high, and his spendthrift militaristic policy is a serious problem.
He built 6 warships.
Indeed, like this is really bad when you can't finance your administration to spend so much on military matters. So when Houston comes back in, Houston is dealing with revived belligerence from Santa Anna himself. So Santa Anna just came back into power in Mexico, coordinate with Sam Houston's reelection to the presidency. Houston, in the intervening time, he's gotten married, he's started his family, he's built a home for his family and such. But he sees that Texas really does need some frugal leadership and some cunning in politics, especially in diplomacy. Texas' position is pretty precarious right now. They've gotten recognition from France. France is the first after the United States to grant the recognition of Texas as an independent state. So France does open an embassy in Austin. They've got trade relations. They really want cotton. That's the main export from Texas. Britain follows in 1840. They recognize the independence of Texas. They open up an embassy. They establish trade relationships. But in 1842, Santa Anna starts making incursions into central Texas. So in, let's see, twice in 1842, San Antonio is captured by Mexican forces. So they march all the way up from the Rio Grande. In March and in September, San Antonio is occupied by Mexican infantry. They push out the Texans, they pillage the town and withdraw. In November of 42, the Texas militia organizes and pursues the Mexicans out of San Antonio, and they go all the way down to the Rio Grande. They capture Laredo, and then they go to Ciudad Mier. Is that how you say that, Riley? You know how to pronounce the Mexican better than me.
I called it Mir in all of my
Mir?
recorded and already published episodes. I didn't even look up how it was pronounced. Probably should have, but for some reason I thought it was Mir. But no,
The
it's probably
true
Mier.
gringo.
Absolutely Mier.
The true gringo is going to go with his first take on the word.
Wow, I said Mir. It's probably Mier. I guarantee you it is. But the men who pursued are kind of famous. They will fight in the Mexican War, and they have a famous group. Something about Texas, something about Rangers, Jack Hayes. These are the guys that pursue the Mexicans back down south.
Yeah, Dawson and Somerville. So they chase the Mexicans, the retreating Mexican force out of San Antonio. They take Laredo. They cross the Rio Grande. At this point, Houston has come back into power as president. He calls for a retreat. He says, we are overextended. We cannot support this. The Mexicans are going to retaliate. Only half of these men withdrew from Laredo. The other half, just on their own authority, advance to Ciudad Mier, which is south of Laredo. It's on the Mexican side of the Rio Grande. It's in between Laredo and McAllen down there in South Texas. So they go to Ciudad Mier, and there they get surrounded by the Mexican army. They get cut off from the riverbank, and they decide to surrender rather than face the inevitable fate of those that remain stalwart and defend it to the last. They don't all want to die. So 243 Texans get captured there. They
This
then
is very
begin that
important, though.
long. Yes.
They fight a multi-day urban battle.
Hmm.
And the men that will survive this are instrumental in the battles to come in the Mexican War, because they survive, they sign back up, they go back down to Mexico. The American army has no idea how to fight a urban style warfare in Monterey or any of the other cities. These Texas Rangers, these men that are captured here, are instrumental in us winning the Mexican War, at least in the North, because they knew how to do urban warfare because of this siege, because of this battle at Mier and Mier. And yeah, that's Bigfoot Walls was there. I mean, very important characters are there that will show up back in the Mexican War.
And these guys have a chip on their shoulder about their experience in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
To put it lightly.
They really want some payback. These are incredible men. The stuff that they went through. So they get captured, and
they killed
then,
600 Mexicans and they only lost 12, by the way.
Wow.
Amazing stuff. It's like Black Hawk Down in Mexico.
And we'll have to talk about what they learned in the Battle of Monterey, because we can't talk about it now, but they teach the U.S. Army exactly how to do urban warfare, and it's incredible.
So these guys, 181 of them escape on the route south towards their imprisonment in Mexico City. So they get away, they go out into the mountains in the desert near Saltillo in Monterey, which is desolate landscape. It's like the landscape in Blood Meridian, right? This is really forbidding country. So they have no food, they have no water, they have no shelter, and they have to surrender themselves or starve. So they surrender themselves, and as a consequence, because they had escaped and killed their guards and such, Santa Anna's authorities want to hang the lot of them. They just want to execute them. They don't want to keep them as prisoners. But because of intercessions from the French, the British, the Americans, they say you can't treat Anglos this way.
Andrew Jackson
Indeed,
interceded.
You've got a detail on that? That's great. Well, so
Santa Anna was brought from after San Jacinto. He was held prisoner, even though Texans said you can go. About 1,000 brand new Americans who just arrived at Texas said no, you can't let them go. Eventually, they chained him to a ball and chain for months. Austin actually smuggled Santa Anna out of Texas and got him to Washington, D.C., and he met with Andrew Jackson, and they had a good conversation. He said, "Oh yeah, I'll promise. I promise I'll give the Texans whatever they want." Of course, he got back and didn't. But Andrew Jackson was like, "I have a good repertoire with Santa Anna. I'll talk to him about releasing, not having them all shot."
So they resolve on decimation instead of just wholesale execution for these escaped Texan prisoners. And so what they do is they put beans in a jar. They've got 181 beans, and they put 17 black beans into the jar, and they have all the prisoners draw a bean out of the jar. And if you draw a black bean out of the jar, you're dead. So they line them up and they shoot them, 17 Texans, and then they walk the rest of them down to captivity in Mexico City, where eventually they get ransomed. Kind of like the Santa Fe expedition. There are a bunch of Anglo ambassadors down there in Mexico City that are looking out for these people. They don't want them to die in captivity. So this is the famous black bean incident. the Black Bean Massacre that takes place in the wake of the Mier expedition in 42. So Houston comes back into power at this stage. We've talked about his attempts to restrain military action on the Rio Grande, and we can see reason why the Texans would volunteer for this, why they aren't going to tolerate the Mexicans pillaging San Antonio and so on. Houston is very concerned with the budget. The Texas dollar, they've been printing paper dollars. The dollars are trading for they're trading for pennies on par. It's not good currency. It's being rapidly undervalued because of the expenditures of the government. They're basically just printing money to cover their expenses. And everyone wants hard currency. Nobody wants to hold the Texas dollar. And it creates this massive inflation problem. So Houston is constantly trying to rein this in. In his first and his second administration, this seems to be one of his number one priorities. Again, Houston is emphasizing diplomacy. The way out of this is to get increased aid from abroad, to get into the good graces of the United States government, to get annexed, to resolve things through diplomacy with the Indians. They don't have any money to spend on war with the Indians. They need to be able to peaceably coexist with them. They need to be able to negotiate something, and they need to settle something with the Mexicans. If they can possibly settle some ceasefire, some arrangement, some trade with Mexico, that'll be greatly to the advantage of Texas. And they simply cannot afford to be at war with the Indians and the Mexicans anymore. So one of the practical results of this is the Treaty of Bird's Fort, which is in the vicinity of Arlington, Texas. So it's up in the north central region of Texas. September of 1843, Houston assembles a council of a lot of different Indian tribes in the area. It's notable that the Apaches, the Kiowas, the Comanches are not involved with this. They are much more belligerent nations, and they are not pacified for decades hence. They are on the warpath. They're constantly pillaging, kidnapping, torturing, murdering. At the Treaty of Bird's Fort, it's the Delawares, the Chickasaws, the Wacos, which I didn't know that Waco was named after an Indian people. The Caddos, which are a Louisiana tribe from the Red River Valley, Cherokees, they all come to the Treaty of Bird's Fort. The provisions of the treaty are all very interesting. So there's the right to prosecute felons without regard for their racial background. So it doesn't matter who killed an Indian, doesn't matter if the alleged murderer is an Indian. They're all prosecuted under the same law in Texas. They declare friendship between the peoples and a ceasefire. They're not at war. They want to have peaceable relations. That there is no illicit liquor sales to the nations, which is always a priority of the chiefs. This is a very consistent thing. There's a wonderful history of this, which I like to recommend. It's called The Great Father, and it's a history of relations between the United States government and the Indian nations. And it's by a Jesuit, I want to say. He's a Roman Catholic historian, and it's a massive history, and it well treats these long and very complex relations. But this is a very consistent theme from George Washington up to modern times. None of the Indian chiefs, none of the responsible leaders of the nations want continued liquor trade with the nations. They declare that women and children are sacrosanct, not legitimate targets of violence on either side. The nations agree to be in an alliance with the Texans against Mexico, and they also delineate territories for the Anglo-Texans to settle in and for the Indians to keep, which is all really interesting. But this is Houston's priority from the start of his political career. He wants some way to coexist alongside the Native Americans. Now I see we're approaching time, so this may be a good place for us to conclude. In 1841, the British began openly debating in Parliament in Westminster about trading their Mexican bonds for lands on the Pacific coast, because the Mexicans are not paying their debts. So it's like a debt for land issue. The British would like to discharge those debts, and they're very interested in California. Now, Houston certainly is taking notice of this. The debates in Parliament are published. The United States is reading those debates with great interest, and they don't want the British taking the Pacific coast. Lots of Americans are going out towards Oregon and Washington at this point. Their status is still in limbo. The British have claims up there. The Hudson's Bay Company has been up there for a long time. The British haven't been settling many people up there. It's mostly fur trappers and such. But the Hudson's Bay Company has been controlling the Oregon country for a long time. Now the British are talking about taking Mexican California in a debt for land deal. And this is Texas' golden opportunity. Houston knows the Americans do not want the British or any European power to have a foothold in the territory of North America. This is contrary to the Monroe Doctrine, which says that the American hemisphere is not to be considered subject for foreign colonization, any further foreign colonization than what's already been established. So this is how Houston makes his cunning play for American annexation. He tries flirting with the British for protection against Mexico. And I think that's a great place for us to pick up.
Knowing what the U.S. would do.
It's going to unite all the Americans on the side of Texas annexation.
And there's a presidential election coming up.
Right. So I think that's a great place for us to pick up next time, where we'll talk about Texas annexation.
Stick a poke in.
Yep. Excellent. Well, we do have some super chats, so let's go through those. Adrian Shepard, 378 for $5 says, "Excellent work, gentlemen. I am relaxing in Palm Desert, listening through this great Southwest arc from the comfort of my bathtub. Sorry for the TMI. I hope it is an old-timey Western bathhouse where you're smoking a $1 cigar."
You can thank the Mexican War and Polk and Houston and everyone for that.
Indeed. Bolero 393 sends $5 saying, "Old Hickory couldn't get Texas in the Union, but young Hickory sure did. All hail the excellent President James Knox Polk. All hail."
And an underrated president.
Oh, yes.
Not in my book. Not in my book.
And Bolero 393 repeats the performance. Americans are always too nice for their own good. Austin pardoning Santa Anna is a case in point. His perfidy knew no bounds. Truer words never spoken. Bolero, thank you very much for the super chat. It means so much. And that
The
being
Texans were trying to do the opposite of what Santa Ana did. Santa Ana had Goliad and Alamo. The Texans were like, the Americans who came wanted to do that too. All of the Mexicans in Santa Ana, but Houston and Austin realized, and the other members of government in Texas realized we can't repeat the offense back because we're better.
it worked out in the end.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Mr. Thomas Wayne Riley, what do you have to shill or otherwise let us know about?
The American Southwest History Podcast and the AmericanSouthwest.com. And that's about it.
Everybody check it out. And Mr. Bagby, what's new from Tall Men Books, amongst other things?
I've got a backlog right now. I've got several manuscripts that are all ready to go. I just have to get covers organized for them. And I'm doing a lot of stuff personally right now, so I can't justify the expense of getting the covers. But I'm gonna get them on the shelf here sooner or later. Got lots of exciting things on the way, but you can find my books at my website, which is www.tallmenbooks.com, where I've got over 50 volumes now available for sale.
You hear that,
And
chat? If you want new books, you must buy the existing books. So everyone, head to tallmanbooks.com and fund this project.
You're doing the Lord's work.
If you email me and want a couple different volumes, I'll give you a special deal. So do reach out. You can find that on the website.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. This has always been a fascinating delve into the history of America's Southwest. What are we talking about next week?
We'll be talking about the annexation of Texas, James Polk's his stance in the race against Henry Clay, some of the sectional tensions between the North and the South that was preventing the ready annexation of Texas back in 1836. And we'll talk about how James Polk attempted to avoid war with Mexico. His efforts to solve the Texas question diplomatically.
Tremendous. Well, we'll all look forward to that, and we will see you all back next week